Thank you, Daniel, for coming.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see some of your shining faces. For Tony, Stephanie, Crystal, Liza, Lauren, Linda, Tom, Daphne, Kirsten, and for everyone else, actually, I have a question for all of you. How present are you planning to be today? If you want to drop that in the chat, yeah, I'd love to know how present you're planning on being today. It's totally cool if it's a 1, if you're listening from your shower, Tony, that's totally cool. If you're in your car or you're actually in another meeting, that's great. And what I would love for you to do is whatever that number is, take a look around your room and see what's one thing you can do to increase that number if that's your intention, or to keep to your intention. One great thing to do is just take your phone and like throw it to the other side of the room, close any tabs. There are studies that show that we are literally less intelligent when we have a phone within our visual range. So I've just put my phone underneath a handkerchief. It's still there if I need it, but it's out of sight. It's out of mind. So I'm also curious to, Tracy, good luck with that performance review there. I also have about a solid hour and change of content. And with that extra half an hour, we can either chit chat or we can go deeper with some of the tools. We can see how we go there. And I'm also really curious, what brought you all here? Like, why did you say yes to this invitation? You can drop that in the chat too. What's one thing that you wanted to get out of today? What brought you to the room? You can drop that in the chat. I'm very curious. I want to make sure I deliver as much value as possible. Good to hear, Christina. Thank you very much. Getting to know you. Getting to know all about you. I guess we just started with songs. I don't think we were recording at that point, at least, but we did have a little bit of Ja Rule and Jennifer Lopez before we get started. And I'm also really curious what conversations you designed. If you have a piece of paper handy, we are going to be sketching together. So if you have a piece of paper and a pen, can you just wiggle it in front of the screen? Thank you very much. Katarina, I love your background, by the way. It's oh so Baroque, as opposed to Daphne's, which is very mod. All are acceptable. So yeah, shake that piece of paper. And what I've done here is I'm curious, you can just draw a big horizontal line, just like a number line that your middle school teacher might have had somewhere in the room. Mine was like pasted all along one whole long wall. And so I have a line from like 0 to infinity. Most of the time when people think about conversations, they think about one-on-one conversations, 2 people chatting together. But I also like to think about the conversations with yourself, group conversations, community conversations, organizational conversations. My brother's biggest disagreement with my book, Elise, was that I didn't include conversations with the infinite. It's like, what about conversations with nature and God, Daniel? I'm like, well, I had to cut off someplace with where my core expertise was. So that's, so I'm really curious. Christina, you're great at spiritual conversations. You're great at the conversations with the infinite. Maybe we should do just a session about that. So if you're really good at one-on-ones, or like Elise, you're great at designing the many-to-many conversations, or maybe you're a really good speaker and you're good at one-to-many conversations, or maybe you're really good at organizational change and organizational dynamics. Or maybe you're really good at having conversations with yourself, right? We're going to talk about the principles of designing conversations that apply across this entire range. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges I have with my book, Elise, is that most of the time when people think about conversations, they think, oh, it's 2 people jamming. I'm like, yeah, that's a dyadic conversation, right? Then there's all these other conversations, the kind of conversations, yeah. And so great. This is awesome. I love, you can also share with me. It'd be very interesting for me to hear from you about, here, I'll drop this in the chat so that helps you. What size of conversations do you spend most of your time on? Where do you spend most of your energy? Think about that whole spectrum. Where do you feel most comfortable? Where is it more of an energetic lift for you? A lot of people say, oh, I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. And I say, you're just somewhere on the spectrum. We all are. There's some people say it costs me a lot to manage a big group conversation. And other people say, oh, I get energy from it. Or I'm, as I did when I first started thinking about conversation design, realizing that when people were bringing me into organizations, they were asking me to change and help them redesign some types of conversations, but I was definitely not allowed to touch any others. And I'll give you a great example. I would come in and I would teach people about innovation and collaboration and problem solving. But what I wasn't allowed to change was who is allowed to test an idea with a customer. You're actually not allowed in many organizations I've worked with. It becomes, and Jessica is giving me a slow nod of recognition, I think, that raise a hand if you've ever had this experience where, well, you can be more innovative, but don't talk to any customers. Right? Me and Jessica, I see you. Thank you. So the kind of conversations I tend to design as an executive coach and a facilitator type of person, things like how might we talk to an executive about getting a bunch of money for our innovation program? That was a fun conversation. Can we turn an hour-long PowerPoint conversation into a 15-minute conversation with no slides? How do we teach a team? How might we get a group to dance on the edge of possibility? Has anybody ever had to do that? Get a group from habitual thinking into thinking on the edge of what is possible? Ian, looks like was that an amen from you? Yeah, that's a thing, right? Who's really good at changing their self-talk? Oh boy, oh boy. That's a hard one. But self-talk is what drives all of the other conversations. Imho. So the thing I'd love for you to share with me, I don't know, for me, I say, when I talk about conversation design, I say that to design is to devise courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. That's Herb Simon's definition. He's a Nobel laureate. I just mean a simpler way to say this is making things better on purpose, as opposed to making them better by accident. All right, show of hands if anybody in their work can make things worse on purpose. That's a lucky, Stacy, that's what we call chaotic evil, right? Making things worse on purpose, right? I feel like many people can't really keep their jobs that long. And we can keep our jobs if we make things better by accident, right? Show of hands if you occasionally make things better by accident. And so, but this is where Socrates and Plato would say life proceeds according to art, right? The ability to shape things through intentionality. And that is what I'm proposing that we can and maybe even should be doing with conversations. And in fact, already are doing with conversations. We are shaping them all the time. The real question I have for you is, what are conversations made of? What do you actually think conversations are made of? Drop it in the chat. What do you actually think when you think about shaping a conversation? What are you shaping? What is it made of? Intentionality, that's super meta, Sue. Thank you. Emotions, purpose, and intent. The space, absolutely. Communication, mental pictures, lenses, metaphors, right? Narratives, interchange, beliefs, purpose, words. Yes, Elise, it's so Shakespearean. Words, words, words. It's one of my favorite quotes from Hamlet. What do you read, sir? Words, words. Yeah, purpose. Yeah. And now, Tracy, for sure, negotiation is an element of conversation. But if you talk to somebody who's an expert on negotiation, they crack open negotiation like a physicist cracks open an atom and says there's structure in there. And that's what I'm asking you all to start to do, is to look with uncomfortable clarity at the structure of conversations. Because I think some of these things are easy to see and easy to shift. And some of these elements are hard to shift and hard to see. Emotions is a classic one. It's actually really hard to change how you feel. It's very hard to change how someone else is feeling. I come at this from the perspective of a designer. I have a degree in industrial design. I worked in interaction design and service design and product design for many years. And so I have the perspective of design as designing physical objects that we shape, that there's materiality. And that's what I wanted to bring to conversation design, was this perspective of what can we see and what can we shift. One thing I will just mention, yes, is in the interest of self-promotion, at least you mentioned some of these things. Some people have already read a little sample of my book. You can get a sample of my book where I load the idea of designing conversations into as much painful detail as I possibly could. I am running a 12-week facilitation masterclass that's coming up in February, which I'd love any of you to join. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you can. And if you want to connect with other people, and if there's somebody here you haven't met before, I love doing a LinkedIn storm. So feel free to drop in your LinkedIn information if you want to connect with other people. And Andrew and I were talking before we started about my podcast, which is where I interview people about designing conversations that matter. It's how I learn. So here's what we're going to do. One of the most powerful ways to design something better is to reflect on designing it terribly. And so I want you to grab another piece of paper if you can, and a pen. I'm going to be putting you in some breakout rooms. Actually, Elise is going to be doing that. Thanks, Elise. You're awesome. I want you to grab a piece of paper, and I want you to turn off your video, turn off your audio, take a moment to hang out with yourself. And I want you to draw if you happen to have had a bad meeting, bad conversation, or you heard about one, or even just want to imagine your nightmare scenario, I'd like you to draw this bad meeting. It can be something recent. It can be something that you've heard about. We are going to be pairing up and sharing these. As I say, you can always say it happened to a friend. You heard about it. You read it on Facebook. So, you can change the names to protect the innocent, but just draw it out, diagram it. And Stacy, Tom, Christina, Tracy, Chris, turn off your video, hang out with yourself, make some weird faces, stretch your facial muscles. I'm going to do the same thing myself. I love changing the interface for the conversation. Turning off video is actually one of the most amazing ways to give people a chance to just relax and enjoy themselves. So it's 1:14 on the Eastern Seaboard. Let's take at least another 2 minutes. You don't have to be a great artist to draw some people and some arrows and some words. Draw this bad meeting. Diagram it. Take at least another minute. Add some detail. If it's a story, maybe you want to storyboard it before, during, and after. How it started and how it's going. All right, so that's like 2 minutes of sketching. If you need another minute, that's cool. When you're ready to rock, Elise is going to put us in breakout rooms in a second. But before we do, Elise, I want to have a family photo. I want everyone to get their video on, and I want to see everybody's sketch of their terrible meeting. You can just hold it, next to your face if you want. That'll be awesome. Show me what you got. Yeah, this is the problem, Tony, with fake backgrounds. It's so hard to hold anything up to the screen. And I think it's one of the best ways to communicate virtually. There you go. That's the trick. Put it directly in front of your face. And that looks pretty intense. Christina, yeah, you got to put it in front of your face. AP, what you got? Show me your terrible meeting. Good man. All right. Oh, I got a screenshot with Tom in there. I think amazing. Thank you all for playing along at home. You're a good sport. I'd be very curious, actually, if you just want to drop in the chat, like what that experience was like. Was it easy, fun, hard, confronting, delightful, interesting, meditative, or any other adjective you'd care to use? What was that experience like of drawing that difficult meeting? Oh, lonely. So lonely, hard. Yeah. Okay. Fair. Illuminating, cathartic, fun and frustratingly true, fun and emergent. Cool. Yeah. Affirming. Oh, that's interesting. Well, Tony, I think it'll be even more affirming when you meet up with someone and share your story with them. Drawing under pressure. Yeah. This is one of my favorite ways to design conversations, by the way. I love to give people time to hang out and think by themselves before they go into group conversation. And I'd love to get people to draw because it consolidates and crystallizes their perspective. I think self-talk is the core of good group conversations, actually knowing what you think. Horrifying. Excellent, man. Good for you. Thank you for your honesty. I salute you for giving it a shot anyway. You don't have to be perfect to be beautiful, as one of my teachers used to say. And I think the ability to draw is one of the most profound ways to shift conversations, and the design of them makes them much more tactile. So Elise, are we ready to rock? Do people have 2s and 3s?
2s and 3s are ready to deploy.
Ready to deploy, sir. I feel like we're in Toy Story and we're like the plastic soldiers with having a conversation with Woody. I think we should have about 10 minutes. I'd ask you to, whoever's story happened most recently, you get to go first. So we get to redesign that little mushing around conversation. If your pairs, you got 5 minutes. I might give you all, like, we're actually doing Jenks great on time. So if we want to do like 11 or 12 minutes so the groups of 3 have time to also say hello, how are you? I missed you, everybody. Nice to see you. That's fine. But please, pretty please, point a time friend to be aware of making sure that everyone gets at least 3 minutes to share their story of their terrible meeting. And then what I'd like you to notice is what is going on. See what you can learn from people's terribly designed meetings. And we'll come back and we'll chat about that in just a quick second. And I'm also curious, now that everyone's shuffling back into the main room, can you describe that conversation in 3 words? I would love it if you would. Describe that conversation. What 3 adjectives would you use to describe that conversation?
This is the breakout room conversation we just had.
Yes, Kristen, thank you so much for clarifying my amorphous instruction. Very similar themes. Those are 3 words. Well done. I like it. Sharing, thoughtful, confirming, reflective. Nailed it in 1, Tony. Cathartic and validating, insightful, revealing, interesting, invigorating, illuminating, connecting. People are messy. Love it. Quote of the day goes to Tom. Well done, sir. Enriching, understand. Well, okay, that's great. I'm glad that was 12 minutes well spent. So here's the thing, like, one of the things that I believe is true is that the quality of our transformation is dependent on the specificity in us of noticing and naming the current state and the desired ideal state. So the quality of the transformation is dependent on the quality of our own specificity in noticing and naming what's going on. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a mental model from my book, The Good Talk, How to Design Conversations That Matter. And I'm actually going to share some slides, because who doesn't love slides? I'm going to put this Google slide link in the chat in a minute, because I'm going to ask you all to collaborate on it in a moment. But for right now, I believe I can share my screen. And so the work that I did in my podcast, when I started it in 2016, 2017, I really was just interviewing people to try and understand, like, well, what does conversation design even mean? I was working with a group in Australia that described their facilitative and transformation practice as conversation design, which, as a designer and even a design thinking person, I was like, well, what does that mean? How do you design a conversation? What is that even about? And so I did maybe like 2 years of interviews and really was trying to think about what's the simplest way, what are the elements that I think are easiest to see and highest impact to shift, to break down a conversation into fundamental elements. Now, this is my conversation OS Canvas, and I totally welcome you having your own. But for right now, I'm just going to share very briefly these 9 elements. People, diversity of the conversation affects the conversation, the invitation and how a conversation is initiated, the power dynamics in a conversation, who has permission to shift it, how is it shifted, turn taking, silence is one of the most profound ways to transform how a conversation proceeds. When I first, my first draft of this OS Canvas, I actually had invitation in the center. And then it was only much later that I was like, well, that is true. It is central. but also true is the fact that the interface, the space that it happens in, is where all of these elements coalesce and interact with each other. My editor at my publisher wanted me to turn cadence and rhythm and turn taking into one element. He's like, I don't know, they seem really similar to me. I'm like, they are related, but they're not the same. And they are connected, but they're not the same. And that's why I kind of put them on opposite sides from each other. I see the pace of the conversation, the musicality. If anybody here, any Five Rhythms fans, anybody into ecstatic dance, or even just an opera fan, there's something about staccato and legato, right? There's different fundamental rhythms. The turn taking and the silence, the substructure is how the cadence and the rhythm gets created. But I think you can also go in the other direction. Threading, we've all lost the thread of a conversation. We've all picked it back up. My favorite way of talking about holding on to that thread so clearly is meeting a friend that you have not seen for decades. We've all had that feeling. You pick up right where you left off. That is a big, solid thread in the conversation that is so easy to hold on to. Whereas the threads of many of the conversations we facilitate are really easy to lose. Lost the thread. Where is the red thread or the green thread or the golden thread? Threading is talked about theoretically in conversational dynamics. And for me, I really wanted to ground it in the fundamental experience that we all have. Okay, just seeing where we are on time, which is somehow amazingly great. Goals and agreements, right? Why we're here, why we've gathered. And then pretty much universally, something will go wrong in a conversation. Error is not something to be avoided. It's something to be anticipated. So how will we notice if something's gone wrong? How do we agree that something's gone wrong versus me blaming someone else that something's gone wrong and they think it's just fine? And how do we fix things? My wife usually is like, I don't want to read your article about the 4 fundamental elements of an apology again, Daniel. I'm like, but it's research backed, honey. And what you just offered is not an apology. So checking it out again. That's what it's like being married to a conversation designer. So some of these elements are much, much easier to see and shift. Like Elise being like cadence and rhythm and turn taking are not the same, right? She's sees the matrix. She's Neo when it comes to meetings. So of course she sees that. Whereas my editor was like, they're the same thing, aren't they? I wrote an entire article about the 4 words that the Japanese language has for space. Each one of them is a different lens on understanding what space is. You know, relational space or physical space, location, locality, proximity, negative space, right? These are all ways to think about space. Invitation, really understanding the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Some people see power and some people just don't. Some people understand that power shapes and sometimes even deforms conversations, and other people are blissfully unaware of it. So I'm really curious. I want you to put your heads down and think about all of those stories you heard. And I'm curious if you can identify in those conversations some of the elements of that poorly defined conversation. What were the elements that were misdesigned? So what I'm going to actually have you do, I'm going to zoom out of my, you should still be able to see my my screen, I believe. So what I've done here, I've just shared a link to this this Google document. It should be open for anybody to notice, to be able to get into that. I'll just confirm that here. If anyone with this link can edit it. And so what I'd like you to do is Elise is going to drop us back into our breakout groups. And so I'm going to ask you to grab a slide for your group by adding your name above. So if you look at one of these slides, there's room for your names. And if you look at one of these slides, if we zoom in, there we go. You can add your names. And what I'd like you to do is to reflect on in these poorly designed conversations that you shared, how were the elements of the conversation operating system terribly designed? And I'm going to give you an entire like 10 minutes to collaborate together. And then we will have a fishbowl conversation when we come back. I really just want you to reflect on, I saw in the chat already, somebody said, oh, well, the power was misdesigned. I want you to be as explicit as possible. And yes, I will totally send the link again. I want you to be as explicit as possible. Oh, at least, oh wait, which link are we talking about, Susan? This is the link to the document. That's the link to the transcript.
Sorry, wrong link.
No, it's all good. Error and repair, right, Elise? Now, here's the thing when you think about error and repair, and I talk about this in the book, there are some people who have got a hot red button that they are ready to hit at all times, where they're like, Elise, what the hell, man, right? Versus other people who let everything roll off their back. Neither of those are particularly legitimate positions. So I look at each of these elements as something that it is not a thing to be done perfectly, but a polarity to be managed. And so I'm curious, when whoever that was said the power was misdesigned, I want you to reflect on what was poorly designed about the way the power was managed in the conversation. You can make as many of these sort of sticky notes as you want. You can just write your notes there. I'd like you to capture as many insights as you can in 10 minutes. Elise, I assume the groups are ready to rock because they haven't been changed.
Yep,
Anybody have
go.
any questions or concerns about the assignment for the next 10 minutes of your lives? Okay, well, let's try that again. You may have to do the thing where some people are the hands and everyone is the voice. If you have trouble where no one in your group can access it, let me know. If you work at an organization where things are locked down, I can't change the way your internet is set up based on that. But I can assure you that this is a public on the web, and anybody who can get here can edit it. So Crystal, I hope that you are in a group with someone who can be your hands. We have to share that responsibility. Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm aware. It's all good. And yes, exactly. Hopefully somebody can screen share and we can all collaborate on it together. That is the way it always has to work.
All right, and we've had
Right.
a couple of shifts, so I'm going to move a couple of you in with some new friends.
Oh, thanks, Elise. I appreciate you managing that. So
All right,
we're
ready to
gonna,
go?
10 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll have a nice fishbowl conversation potentially.
All right, enjoy.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad we all collaborated on that. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Let's take a moment. I've been absorbing some of your wisdom in this Google Google Slides document. If you haven't yet, you might just want to take a little wander around, take a look at some of the other teammates' thoughts. What I'm going to be asking you to do is to get into the chat in a minute. As I mentioned before, I think the quality of a transformation is dependent on the specificity of our ability to notice and name what's happening and what we want to shift. And so when I look through the Google Slides document, I definitely see some people who are identifying the element. And I'm also seeing some people who are identifying what they think their point of view is on what is not going well with the element and what they would do differently. And that's what I want to harvest in the chat specifically. What did you notice was badly designed, and what is, in your opinion, in your value system, through your lens, as the type of facilitator and leader you are, anchoring in your purpose, right, Elise? Like, what would you want to do differently, thinking about that badly designed meeting, all of the ones that you've heard and the ones that you've shared? Take a moment. I really want to get some shared wisdom in the chat. And if you noticed something in the Google document that you're like, whoa, that's insightful from another team, and you want to drop it in the chat, drop it in the chat too. Let's try to collect as much wisdom as we can about more intentional ways to shape these elements of a conversation. And then I'm going to invite potentially a few people up onto the stage to have a little bit of a fishbowl conversation where we can dig a little bit more deeply into these elements in conversation together. I can share my screen 100%, Crystal. I will slowly climb through all of the elements. I'm going to start at the top, see what we got here. For those of you who weren't in the program at all, this will be like a little walk down memory lane for you. So here we are in slide 7. We talked about meeting expectations, not or were potentially were set and understood in advance. Power and permission, different needs, perceptions. And as I go through these, if there's stuff that you want to bring into the chat, I see at least one element I see one thing that's come up in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to invite people to join me based on ones that I like. Sue and Hope, do you want to talk a little bit about the turn taking in silence in this meeting? Take yourselves off mute and share a little bit more about that. And Marta and Jessica, complaining about people who are outside of the room. Tell me a little bit more about how that's related to power. That's really interesting. This is often the case, is that people say, well, the people who we need to be here are not in the room. Different people with different goals, right? That can also be a real challenge, right?
Well, it
Or
was more
interesting.
like
Yeah.
the boss having the power to be the one who criticizes other people and tells the others, I know the truth, so listen to me, and I can criticize the others which are not there. So
Yeah.
it was that situation.
Yeah. And what's the impact of that, Marta?
Well, the impact is that everybody shuts down and doesn't say anything anymore. So there's no exchange.
Yeah. And I have an opinion about why that might be, but I'm wondering, why do you think that shuts people down? Either
they agree or they don't agree. But if it's the boss who is having all the saying, then you don't say no, but listen, that people you're criticizing, it's not that way. Or so he's showing his power through this criticizing.
Yes, definitely. That's really true. I love that. And I think there's a component also of, it's not an equal invitation, right? Everyone doesn't feel invited to speak that way because it's not generally well regarded to. In fact, it's one of the, in Jewish law, it's a sin to speak about somebody who's not present negatively. True story. Rebecca, Tony, do you want to talk about like the agenda not being shared intentionally and critical voices not being at the table? I feel like that's where perhaps the invitation or the thread is not really clear for the conversation, in my perspective.
Are you wanting to know what happened or what we should do differently?
I'm really curious what you noticed and how you would design it differently in your perspective when it comes to inviting critical voices to the table and sharing the intention of an agenda, not just the agenda, but not the what, but the why.
Yeah. In this particular case, like I wasn't in charge of the meeting, and it was a deliberate, it was like a 3-day shareholders meeting, and one critical shareholder was not going to be there on a specific day when they had the most knowledge about a specific issue. And so it wasn't intentionally not shared that that item wasn't going to get talked about until the day that they weren't there. So it became kind of a trust issue, right? Because it was felt that it was done intentionally to talk about it when that person wasn't there.
Yeah, that's super awkward. It's like being sandbagged.
Yeah.
This is something that comes up a lot, by the way, also that the person with the power is the person who's doing most of the talking. That's certainly the case in Marta's conversation. And Rebecca, it sounds like that also manifested in the conversation that you were having. And one of the things that I think is maybe most profound about what I would call conversational leadership or facilitation, or just being a good person, is using your power to invite other people into the space, right? That's a really powerful thing to do. Then maybe the more conventional approach is to just get to monologue. Elise, is there anything you're seeing in the chat? It's actually very hard for me to look at everything at once. Or is anybody else see something in the chat that they think is interesting and that they want to highlight?
So Katerina had an interesting point about how much easier it is to do all of this and to get all of these elements humming together nicely when you're conversing with people you like.
Ha, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I was just thinking myself how challenging it is to lean into that discomfort.
Yeah, and Elise and I were talking while we were in the break about reducing polarity, right? The Better Angels Project, and one of my favorite questions to ask people that you disagree with is to say, "How long have you? Tell me about when you first started to think like that." All right, so you, instead of saying like, "I don't like that opinion," just say, "Well, tell me a story. Tell me a story of how you came to think in that way." And it can be very easy to dislike somebody's opinion and therefore dislike them. But if they tell you the story, then it becomes a narrative. It becomes human. We can empathize with their journey. Oh, that's when it went terribly wrong for you. And so this is always, oh, sorry, was there more you wanted to say about that? Whoever was laughing, I appreciated the laugh. Was that you, Katarina?
I was laughing. It's a way to empathize
Yes.
with the experience of that person.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so it turns a fact into a narrative.
Yeah.
We can disagree with the result they've gotten to, but we can understand the question of why are you like this? We can actually, instead of saying, why are you like this? We can say, well, tell me about how you came to think this way, which is a much more inviting question. Nobody can answer the question, why are you like this? And I'm sure there's many people we'd love to ask that question of.
To maybe just add two words to the whole thing about the liking and whatever. I was thinking specifically there about, let's say, an ongoing relationship, let's say with a colleague, where you just don't jive with that person. And it's just every conversation that you have, even if it's not necessary, even if it's just very mundane about a client or whatever, and it's just so much work. And
yes, it is work.
It is, yes. But underlyingly, you really just don't necessarily like each other. And then it just becomes a hurdle to bring the energy to each conversation.
And that's why, there's some people who look at icebreakers and warm-ups as fluff, and often they are. The question of how we create that human connection, how do we design an experience so that people can see each other as human so that we can do great work together, is non-trivial, right? For you and this person you're talking about, Katarina, the ability to investigate our own stories about a person and why we think that, to shift our narrative about that person, is work, right? But sometimes it's work that has to get done to change the story of, oh, well, our relationship is broken. And this happens all the time. I was doing a coaching session with someone who was asking me, well, should I, there's this person and I just don't think that they can do this job. Therefore, how do I fire them so that I can hire on someone who can? And I'm like, well, are you sure she can't do this job that you want her to do? And it turned out they hadn't really had the conversation about what she really wanted of this role. And so she was just collecting all the stories she could to be able to tell herself the story. I can convince the board this and I can get rid of her that, and then I can hire the person who I want to hire. Not asking the question, how might I help this person grow into this role? Because it's a lot of work to do that. She didn't want to have that conversation, which is totally fine. To admit to herself, how do I fire this person? That's the conversation she wanted to have. I also want to talk about this. One of my favorite challenges in conversation design is here: lack of clarity on decision-making authority and an actual process for making decisions. Right? Is this collaborative? Is this a monarchy? Is it an oligarchy? Is it an aristocracy? Is this representative democracy? Or is it what we call participation theater? Right? Is it a decision that has already been made behind the scenes, and this meeting is actually a lie? We've all been to meetings like that, where the actual meeting has already happened, and the conversation is a farce. I think that's a classic.
Daniel in the chat, Nan has
yes,
a question about thoughts on the retribution issue, which the meeting that is a farce might help spin up.
Yeah, Nan, can you say more about the retribution issue?
Well, the retribution issue is if the person actually is in a place of power. So example, if you have a department chair who asks for your input, doesn't really want to hear the input, and then when people bring up ideas or disagree, then you see the repercussions on how some decisions are made.
Yeah.
Because there isn't clarity about how decisions are made beyond that they have the power and they'll make them.
Yeah. It sounds like this has happened to you.
We're living it.
Yeah. Well, what do you see as your options to shift the conversation?
Well, this is a tricky one because poor Andrew already had to hear this, but we know the individual does struggle with some mental health issues. And so it's the gap between they know how they should communicate and the old behaviors bleed through. And so it's a hard one because how you're empathetic because you know they're doing a lot of hard work on themselves. But it's not necessarily coming through in their behavior when they're interacting with others.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a hard one because part of me wants to have that conversation, but it's kind of a scary one because
well, so that's why
perceiving it wrong, that might not be the issue.
Yeah. And so this is where, so there's a couple of things I want to unpack and I was potentially, I'd much rather, I don't know how everyone else is feeling, but I'd much rather keep this conversation going and hear from a few other people about this. But to your question on when we talk about designing the arc of a conversation, a simple, the invitation, the narrative that's holding the arc together, and the goals that we're trying to get to as a result of this conversation are a good way to think about the conversation. And for you, Nan, the first conversation you're having with yourself is, do I even want to have the conversation? That's why conversations are difficult, right? Because we're having a negotiation with ourselves. And there's at least, there's several elements that can help you think through this. And one is just to clarify what your goals are. And can you try to understand what their goals are? Do you know what they want? You're saying that they want to change, but it's hard for them to change. Do you really want to have the conversation? Do you really want to step into this and try to make a change? And so it's really, really helpful just to clarify what your goals are. As my mom would say, start as you mean to continue, right? And really start with the question of, do I want this? What is my real goal? And one simple way to do that is to just think about what are 3 words that you would use to describe how you would like to feel at the end of the conversation. And one of my favorite things to do is just to get a sticky note and write on it, sticky side up, write those 3 words, and then just stick it behind your monitor so that you can see those 3 words. Anchor with your physical space, your intentionality, whatever you want to feel, open, honest, you want to feel like you want to crack it open, whatever it is, however you would say, I want this conversation to go, have your own goal clear in mind. But as you said, you have your story and they have their story. And this is one of the fundamental challenges with all communications. You don't actually know what their story is necessarily. And so we have our story. We think we are a reliable narrator of that story. Whereas, has anybody ever read a book with an unreliable narrator? I'm trying to think of a good example of a story with an unreliable narrator. Maybe like Bright Lights, Big City is a really interesting, I don't know if who's read that one. It's a first person novel, which is totally mind breaking and super fun. You think, Nan, that your story is reliable, but you're well, maybe it's not all true. And the other component is when we first started this conversation, where is he? Andrew and I were talking about Adam Kahane's work. In his book, Collaborating with the Enemy, he has a wonderful diagram where he breaks out the, I think I can actually share my screen for this one very briefly. He has this wonderful diagram to say like, okay, can we change the situation? No. Can we bear it as it is? No, then we walk away. Can we bear it as it is? Okay, well then let's adapt. Can we change the situation? Okay, well, can we affect it unilaterally? Great, force your way through. Why not? And if you can't, then you have to potentially engage in what he calls stretch collaboration, which is deeply engaged with the other person's narratives and opinions, which is non-trivial. And that's where in negotiation theory, knowing what your BATNA is always valuable. What's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? What can you walk away with if you don't have this conversation? Can you live with not having the conversation? If you can't live without having the conversation, then you have to ask yourself, what do I want? What do they want? What story are they telling? What story am I telling? And how can I invite them to the table in the most powerful way, which is, connecting to their purpose, if we can. That was my tirade on that issue, and I hope that was remotely helpful.
One other thought on this, if you're open to it.
Yeah, totally.
So one of the things I've seen with a number of the leadership clients that we work with is that they have learned that they need to ask for input and feedback. And so they ask for input and feedback. And when you hear those specific words, know that they have the intentionality of getting feedback, but have not got a good idea about what kind of feedback they need or what they will do with it. So they may get feedback, they may not. It's a great opportunity to do some assistance, some facilitation as the recipient, and ask to help clarify what that ask is.
Yeah.
You're looking for feedback. What kind of feedback would be most useful for you here? And what would you like to be able to achieve with that feedback? Are you looking for, we just want to, what's in scope? We can change the color, but we can't change the poster. The words are all there, right?
Yeah.
So those kinds of just questions of curiosity about what's behind that request and how you can make that of service to them opens up a way to get at their goals that is just right in the flow of that moment.
Yeah. And so I'll add, I had a wonderful conversation with three of some of my favorite people about leading a culture of critique, because designing how critique is supposed to go at a company or for a team is transformative. I always say the most important meeting to have is the meeting about meetings, right? To talk about talking. And I know Lisa's like, yeah. There was a hilarious Atlassian article where they're like, here's the 6 types of meetings. And they were like, the meeting you should never have is the meeting about meetings. I'm like, wrong. Okay. So Susan, do you want to, can you come off mute and tell me about encouraging listening and the context for this a little bit? Because I think there's an element of the OS that I want to connect to this.
Sure. I guess it started with one observation, which was you seem to be using meetings and conversation interchangeably. And we mostly were talking about conversations that weren't necessarily designed meetings.
Yes.
There was spontaneous meeting, which was a conversation.
Yeah, fair. I do blend them. Martin Buber says that all real living is meeting. And so I would say that it's like what did Jesus say? When any two are gathered in my name, I'm there, right? I would say a conversation is a meeting and a meeting is a conversation. And some people would say, well, is it a monologue, a conversation? I'm like, yes, it's just a deeply deformed conversation where the only response that's expected is rapt attention.
Fair
right?
enough.
As opposed to equal participation, which we would say would be an equal conversation as opposed to an unequal conversation. I don't know if that
Yeah,
is helpful.
no, and we went with that. And then one of the
Good.
first thing that came up that was an issue was the made the meeting terrible was the lack of listening. So there was turn taking.
Yes.
There was a cadence. There was, all the elements sort of were there, but nobody was listening to each other.
Yes.
And so therefore the meeting didn't work. So my question was kind of, as you think
Yes.
about the OS of the meeting,
Yes.
what do you do to encourage listening?
Totally.
It seems like you can have all the elements and still have no listening going on.
Yeah. So actually, the third element of the conversation operating system that my editor wanted to collapse into one element was threading.
Okay.
I was like, no way. Because in listening and responding, right, there is silence. So there's space between, or there can be space between when one person speaks and the next person speaks. And in my book, I refer to my friend Darcy, and maybe you have a friend like this who is highly discursive and extremely tangential. What's amazing about Darcy is that he always brings it back. He always brings it back. I don't know how he does it. It's a wild ride. And you go everywhere, but then he lands the plane. And there's some people who just go everywhere and it never comes back. When you listen, your response can be silence. It can be inquiring to get more. It can be to agree or disagree or to react, to jump to a conclusion using your high error recognition system to say, like, what do you mean by that? That's not really a question that says, what do you mean by that? That's you already presume that they meant harm in what they said. And so pulling at the threads of somebody's turn and using your turn to go deeper into theirs is an act of generosity and humanity. And that's something that I think you have to train to, coach to, encourage, facilitate, design and build that culture. Unfortunately, and Elise, I'm sure you know this a lot better than I do, there are so many organizations that are stuck in 30-minute meeting cultures with back-to-back meetings where the cadence is very, very intense. And one of the things that I've learned is that we cannot think when we're under stress. It's literally inhibited by stress and racing forward. And so the ability to have silence, encourage silence in a meeting is weird for some people. It's not part of as you said, that the operating system of that particular meeting. But it is so transformational to have more silence, more listening, and more reflection in a conversation in a meeting, depending on if you want to conflate the two. I'm sure Elise knows lots about silent meetings. I wrote very briefly about it here. I'm a fan of having less talking in a in a really good conversation. I think it can be really, really transformational. And I'm going to actually, because I mentioned it, I'll paste it in here. This article about these four words in Japanese language about space and negative space. When I was in design school, Susan, we spent, I said, an entire class. We were talking about negative space for an entire semester, really trying to create negative space in this composition we were building. And the ability to create more negative space in a conversation means that there's more room to breathe and to think, right? Silence. Not for nothing, Japanese culture loves negative space. Think about a rock garden and just how peaceful it is to look out on basically visual white noise, a field of pebbles just raked nicely. And I think it's possible to create conversational landscapes that are like that too, but it is hard because we're pushing against the cultural conversational operating system, which is, all right, everybody, what are we here to do? What's the elevator pitch? Give it to me. What do we got to do? What's our big decision? Let's take the upper left-hand, right-hand quadrant of the importance difficulty matrix and let's go. And that's not necessarily where the gold is. I think the gold is in taking a bath in the conversation, but that's just me. Those are the kind of baths that I like to take. Sorry, I hope that that was me just tirading, but my point is it's a choice. Right. And whether meetings are improvisational or unplanned, it's fine. There's still the structure, which is each person's own proclivities towards silence, towards what me and my Jewish brethren call high collaborative overlap, where we're not arguing, we're just all talking at the same time, right? And that's just expected. Whereas for other people, when they come into it, it's hard for people who are not of the high collaborative overlapped cultures to wrangle or to even step in to that double Dutch game. You know, it's like, if you've ever watched kids play double Dutch, there's those two ropes going so fast. And how do you step into that unless somebody really teaches you how, really invites you into that conversation? It can be really hard to jump into a conversation that feels like it's running away without you. And that's,
I
and I
think
think
one of my favorite
sorry.
phrases from your book, that high conversational overlap, that bit where we don't always have to be quiet in between to be having a conversation.
Yeah.
Depending on our culture.
But right. And we have to be aware, this is where diversity comes into the conversation as well.
Mhm.
There was, I'm blanking out on his name. I follow him on Twitter. He's a host on NPR. He's a Black gentleman, and somebody had messaged him about how he's like, they were like, it sounds like you're constipated, like while you're interviewing people, like you're all like mmming and eyeing all the time. Like, why can't you just like listen? And he's like, I don't always respond to these. He posted that letter, and he said, like, what I'm doing is what in Black culture is totally natural. If you're sitting in church, there's a lot of rumbling and aim and responding, and that is how you listen. And this guy was clearly not from that culture and was like, I don't get it. This is not for me. And he's like, no, that is correct. And so this is where two operating systems can collide, and having the conversation about like, so when I overlap, I'm not disagreeing, there's always space for you. I have to talk to my wife about this because, she has a different operating system, and we have to, yeah, exactly. Family, mother-in-law can't get an edgewise, right? And so sometimes this is where I think good design can be generous and kind, realizing that there's other people who think differently than you and have different proclivities, and inviting them into the conversation, using your turn, not to react or respond to what's already on the table, but to bring somebody to the table. It's a very generous and warm use of power. And we all have that power in the moment. Yeah, sorry. I know we're at time.
Speaking of design and the table and whatnot, we are getting towards the end of our time. So if you have been to our sessions before, we do end on time. And then Daniel and I will hang out afterwards if anybody has something they'd really like to dig into a little bit more, sort of after party, speaker at the front thing. But before we go, I would love for you to take a second or two in your head and just consider, we talked about a lot of things. There's been Zen gardens and canvases and drawing and all of that. And of all of that stuff, if you were to share this with somebody who couldn't come or who's catching the recording later, what would you tell them? What's the one thing that for you are most likely to use that you heard today? And you're welcome to indicate that you'd like to speak or just put it in the chat. I'd just love to hear what your takeaway is here today. Meeting about the meeting, yes.
That's a win.
We have like 5 templates about that, Nan.
Meetings about meetings. Yeah, designing silence into the conversation. That's wonderful. I love that, Jessica. Drop the curtain on participation theater.
That sounds like such a fabulous LinkedIn post.
It does.
Jessica, you've got to run with that.
That or Elise and I will write it before you. So you better start now.
Love the breakdown. Good job, Daniel.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. And Elise, thank you for facilitating me.
The importance of design. Yeah, always, right? Design is the expression of your intention in a way that other people can join you in. So, all right, so go ahead and keep sharing your thoughts. And while you're sharing things, I had a request, and I think it's a great one, to also share your LinkedIn information. So if you're ready to do that and would like to connect with any of these lovely people, the LinkedIn storm is on. It's raining connection requests.
It's raining connections. Hallelujah. No. That's how many we're just going to sing the whole time, sing to the whole meeting.
Now, for full disclosure, we do post the chat afterwards with the meeting recording. So if you get a request from somebody who you didn't see here, they may be yet another meeting enthusiast friend finding you on LinkedIn from where this lives
Random
afterwards.
connections.
Yeah, the meeting enthusiast randos are all on LinkedIn is what it is. Wonderful. And then one final last bit of business. We host these sessions about once every couple of weeks. They're all different people, different topics, different kinds of things. And we do it because we like to learn. One of the things I would like to learn from you is, what did you think? Was this useful? What would you do differently? What did you like? What you didn't? So in the chat, top link is our feedback form. I encourage you to open it right this very minute, because if you end this meeting, you walk away, you will not do it. So just do it now. It'll take you 2 minutes, and we would so appreciate the gift of your insight. And I'm being very specific in the feedback we ask for there, just as feedback now, but I promise they're real questions. Going forward in the community where you registered for this, we will post the recording, we'll repost the chat, the transcript, the slides, all of that. And save the date. Our next session is February 10th. We'll be hosting Judy Reese and Joe Badman and David Heath as we look at combining liberating structures, which is a facilitation framework, with clean language, which is a way of using your words to create metaphorical systems of thought. And it's like, all kinds of framework mashup madness, and it'll be really cool. So
I'm a big fan of clean language. It's a thing. Clean
language is the bomb. That may not be a clean way to say it, but it is still accurate. So. And with that, we are officially at our closing time. So thank you, everybody who came and for hanging out with us. And if you need to go now, we hope to see you at some other time. Thank you so much. And if you're going to stay, go ahead and unmute and let us hear your ideas.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. You're awesome.